In the crowded streets of early 20th century Brooklyn, New York, a boy named Alphonse Gabriel Capone took his first steps into a world that would one day know him as Al Capone, the most infamous mob boss in American history. Born on January 17, 1899, Al Capone was the fourth of 9 children in a struggling Italian immigrant family. His father, Gabriel, was a barber, and his mother, Teresa, worked as a seamstress. They had crossed the Atlantic from Naples in search of a better life, like so many immigrants of that era, carrying with them little more than hope, determination, and the desire to provide their children with opportunities they themselves had never known. Brooklyn was a melting pot at the time, teeming with Irish, Jewish, and Italian families who fought for survival in crowded tenements. Poverty was everywhere, and children often grew up fast. For Al, the streets became both playground and classroom. From an early age, he witnessed firsthand the rough realities of immigrant life, discrimination, limited job prospects, and the constant need to prove oneself in a neighborhood where toughness often meant survival. Al's parents tried to instill discipline and values in their children. His father, though stern, was respected for his work, and his mother was deeply religious, hoping her children would stay on the right path. But the streets of Brooklyn were filled with temptations and influences that no parent could fully shield their child from. For Al Capone, that environment left a lasting mark. By the time he reached school age, Capone showed flashes of intelligence, but also a fiery temper. Teachers described him as bright, but difficult to control. His impatience with authority and his readiness to settle disputes with his fists set him apart from his peers. At the age of 14, his temper brought his education to an abrupt end. After striking a teacher who had disciplined him, young Al was expelled. That single moment closed the door to a traditional path in life and pushed him further into the world of street gangs and petty crime. In Brooklyn, gangs were everywhere, and each neighborhood seemed to have its own. These groups offered boys like Al something they couldn't get at home: protection, belonging, and the promise of fast money. Capone's first brushes with the underworld came through these gangs. He started as a lookout and errand boy, learning how to survive in the criminal hierarchy. It was in these early years that he encountered the likes of Johnny Torrio, a man who would later become both mentor and partner. But before Torrio's influence took hold, Al's rough edges became apparent. He wasn't just another street kid. He had charisma, a certain charm that made him stand out. Despite his lack of formal education, he was sharp, quick to read people, and even quicker to adapt. He learned how to talk his way out of trouble and, when words failed, how to fight his way through. This combination of charm and intimidation would become a hallmark of his criminal career. During these formative years, Capone also earned the scars that gave him his infamous nickname. Working as a bouncer in a Coney Island saloon, he insulted a woman while on the job. Her brother slashed Capone across the face, leaving 3 deep scars that ran from his left ear to his jawline. The wounds earned him the nickname Scarface, a moniker he despised but could never escape. To Capone, the scars were a reminder of his youthful recklessness, yet to the public they became a symbol of the violent world he inhabited. Despite his tough exterior, those who knew Capone in his youth often described him as polite, even well-mannered, when he wanted to be. He had a soft side, especially toward his family. In 1918, at just 19 years old, he married May Coughlin, an Irish Catholic girl from Brooklyn. Together they had one son, Albert Francis, Sonny Capone. Though Al was already dabbling deeper into the world of organized crime, he longed to provide for his family in ways his parents never could. This duality, the devoted family man on one hand and the ruthless gangster on the other, would define Capone's life for decades to come. As the teenage years gave way to adulthood, Al found himself drawn further into the orbit of organized crime. New York at the time was alive with opportunity for those bold enough to take it. Prohibition had not yet begun, but gambling, prostitution, and petty rackets were thriving. Capone worked in various clubs and saloons, often under the wing of more seasoned criminals. Every job, every connection, taught him something new about the mechanics of the underworld. Perhaps most importantly, he came under the mentorship of Johnny Torrio, a fellow Italian immigrant who had risen through the ranks of organized crime with a calm, businesslike approach. Torrio recognized Capone's potential early on. Where others saw just another hot, headed street fighter, Torrio saw leadership, ambition, and the kind of instincts that couldn't be taught. Their relationship would set the stage for Capone's eventual rise to power in Chicago. Yet in these Brooklyn years, Capone was still very much a product of his environment. He was a hustler, willing to do whatever it took to climb a little higher and make a little more. He was tough enough to survive the streets, smart enough to see opportunities, and charming enough to build alliances. By the time he reached his early 20s, the foundation of the man who would become the Untouchable Mob Boss had already been laid. Brooklyn had shaped him in ways that would never leave. It gave him his toughness, his scars, his first taste of gang life, and his earliest lessons in power and loyalty. For Capone, Brooklyn wasn't just where he was born. It was where the legend began. This chapter of his life is crucial to understanding the man he would become. Behind the headlines of violence and corruption that would later define him, there was once a boy struggling to make his way in a world stacked against him. The tenements of Brooklyn, the roughneck gangs, the early mistakes, and the powerful mentors all combined to create a man who was destined to leave an indelible mark on American history. And as the streets of Brooklyn hardened Al Capone, fate was already pointing him westward, to a city where Prohibition would create a gold rush for criminals, and where his name would echo through history, Chicago. By the early 1910s, Al Capone was no longer just another kid on the Brooklyn streets. He had already left behind his school days, carried the scars of a street brawl that branded him, Scarface, and started a family of his own. But the restless young man wasn't content with the life of a barber's son or a factory worker like so many of his immigrant neighbors. Capone had tasted the raw energy of the underworld, and he knew there was more money, more power, and more respect waiting for him in the shadows of organized crime. Brooklyn at the time was alive with opportunity for gangsters. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels dotted the neighborhoods, and behind every operation was a network of mobsters pulling the strings. These were men who commanded respect not by education or social standing, but by muscle, money, and intimidation for a boy like Capone. With limited options and a taste for risk, the gang life was not just an escape from poverty. It was a pathway to influence. Capone's early years in crime began humbly with small tasks for local gangs. He served as a lookout, ran errands, and occasionally acted as muscle when disputes turned violent. These jobs might have seemed minor, but they were his initiation into a world governed by codes of loyalty, secrecy, and ruthless ambition. He quickly proved himself as dependable, someone who could be trusted to keep quiet and follow orders, but also someone who wasn't afraid to use his fists when necessary. It wasn't long before Capone fell in with more established figures in the New York underworld. One of his earliest affiliations was with the Five Points Gang, a notorious group that had once dominated Manhattan's Lower East Side. Although its power had waned by the time Capone joined, the gang still provided him with valuable connections and lessons in organized crime. Under the leadership of men like Paul Kelly, Capone observed how rackets were run, how money flowed from illegal enterprises, and how political corruption kept gangsters one step ahead of the law. During this period, Capone also began working at the Harvard Inn, a saloon on Coney Island owned by mobster Frankie Yale. The Harvard Inn wasn't just a bar. It was a front for a variety of criminal activities, from gambling to prostitution. For Capone, the job was more than a paycheck. It was an education in vice, a place where he could watch seasoned criminals handle business and learn the art of intimidation without unnecessary violence. It was at the Harvard Inn that Capone earned his infamous scars. After making a crude remark to a woman, her brother retaliated by slashing Capone's face with a knife. The incident left him permanently marked, but it also gave him an aura of toughness. Though he despised the nickname Scarface, the wounds only reinforced his reputation as someone not to be trifled with. In later years, Capone would even attempt to hide the scars in photographs by tilting his head or covering the left side of his face. But to the public, the image of Scarface became part of his legend. Despite the violence, Capone's time at the Harvard Inn highlighted another side of his personality, his charm. Patrons and colleagues often described him as polite, even charismatic. He had a gift for conversation and knew how to win people over with a smile as easily as he could with a threat. This dual nature, ruthless when necessary, yet personable and likable, set him apart from many of his peers, where others relied solely on fear. Capone understood the value of influence and persuasion. Frankie Yale, impressed by Capone's loyalty and work ethic, became another key figure in his life. Yale was a well-connected mobster with ties across New York and beyond. He taught Capone the importance of running crime like a business, of keeping order among one's men, and of maintaining relationships with politicians and law enforcement. For Capone, this was a crucial lesson. Power wasn't just about violence. It was about strategy. During these years, Capone continued to balance his personal life with his growing criminal career. His marriage to Mae Coughlin gave him stability at home, and his young son, Sonny, provided motivation to succeed. But success, in Capone's eyes, wasn't about honest work. It was about seizing the opportunities that the underworld provided. The most important opportunity came through his growing relationship with Johnny Torrio. Torrio, a calm and calculating mobster, had already made a name for himself in New York before moving to Chicago to help his uncle, Big Jim, Colosimo, run a flourishing vice empire. Torrio frequently returned to Brooklyn and stayed connected with old associates. He saw in Capone a blend of toughness and intelligence that reminded him of himself in his younger years. Torrio took Capone under his wing, offering advice and planting the seeds for what would later become Capone's empire. Torrio's mentorship was transformative. He taught Capone the importance of patience, the art of negotiation, and the value of building alliances. Torrio believed in making crime efficient and profitable, avoiding unnecessary attention from the authorities whenever possible. This approach stood in stark contrast to the reckless violence of many gangsters of the era. Under Torrio's influence, Capone began to think less like a street brawler and more like a businessman. But Brooklyn had its limits. By the late 1910s, competition among gangs was fierce and opportunities for advancement were shrinking. Torrio saw bigger possibilities in Chicago, where Prohibition was about to create a demand for illegal alcohol unlike anything the country had ever seen. And when Torrio extended the invitation to Capone to join him in the Windy City, Capone knew this was his chance to break free from the small time rackets of New York and step onto a larger stage. As Capone prepared to leave Brooklyn behind, he carried with him the lessons he had learned from the Harvard Inn, the 5 Points Gang, Frankie Yale, and most importantly, Johnny Torrio. He had learned how to fight, how to charm, how to run rackets, and how to keep his eyes on the bigger prize. Brooklyn had forged him into a capable gangster, but Chicago would give him the empire that would make him a legend. This chapter of Capone's life was about transformation. No longer just Al, the immigrant boy from a poor neighborhood. He had become Capone the gangster, a man with connections, skills, and ambition. The making of Al Capone wasn't complete yet, but the foundation was set. With Torrio guiding him in Prohibition just around the corner, the stage was ready for his meteoric rise. The streets of Brooklyn had prepared him for survival, but the streets of Chicago would offer something greater, the chance to rule. When Al Capone boarded the train bound for Chicago in the early 1920s, he was leaving behind more than Brooklyn's crowded tenements and familiar streets. He was leaving behind the small time rackets, the petty fights, and the lingering sense that his potential was bigger than the opportunities New York could offer. Ahead of him lay a city brimming with ambition, corruption, and wealth waiting to be seized. Chicago was a place where fortunes could be made overnight, and for Al Capone, it was where destiny was calling. Johnny Torrio had already established himself as a trusted lieutenant in Chicago's underworld. He worked under his uncle by marriage, Big Jim Colosimo, who ran a lucrative empire of brothels and gambling dens. Torrio, however, was forward-thinking. He saw that Prohibition, the nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, was about to transform the criminal landscape. To Torrio, illegal liquor wasn't just a new racket. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and he wanted men he could trust at his side. Capone, with his mix of toughness, intelligence, and loyalty, was exactly the kind of man Torrio needed. Chicago in the 1920s was a city of contrasts. On one hand, it was bustling with industry, culture, and a booming population. On the other, it was a city riddled with corruption, with politicians and police officers often bought and paid for by mobsters. The city's neighborhoods were divided along ethnic lines, each with its own gangs fighting for dominance. Violence was common, but so was opportunity. In this environment, Capone quickly realized that Chicago was not just another city. It was the ideal breeding ground for organized crime. Torrio introduced Capone into his operation slowly at first. Capone began by managing a few of Torrio's gambling dens and brothels, ensuring that business ran smoothly and that profits were collected without disruption. He earned a reputation for being both tough and fair, someone who commanded respect but also knew how to keep things under control. Torrio valued Capone's ability to balance intimidation with charm, a skill that made him effective not just with underlings, but also with customers and political contacts. As Capone settled into his new role, he also began to adapt to Chicago's way of doing business. Unlike New York's street gangs, Chicago's underworld operated like a corporation. Every racket was part of a larger structure, designed to maximize profit and minimize unnecessary bloodshed. Torrio's philosophy was simple: keep violence to a minimum, maintain good relationships with politicians, and focus on making money. Capone absorbed these lessons, learning how to run criminal enterprises not as reckless ventures, but as carefully managed businesses. Yet, even in this disciplined system, Capone's presence stood out. He had an instinct for leadership, a knack for spotting opportunities, and a willingness to take risks when others hesitated. His boldness caught Torrio's attention, and before long, Capone was entrusted with more responsibility. By his mid-20s, he was no longer just an enforcer. He was Torrio's right-hand man. Capone also began to make a name for himself outside the gang. He dressed sharply, favoring tailored suits, silk ties, and expensive hats. He carried himself with confidence, blending the polish of a businessman with the aura of a gangster. To the public, he appeared larger than life, a figure who moved easily between the world of crime and the world of high society. He attended baseball games, dined at the city's best restaurants, and cultivated relationships with journalists who found him both fascinating and newsworthy. But beneath the polished image, Capone was building something more important: connections. In Chicago, politics and crime were deeply intertwined. Bribes flowed as freely as liquor, and Capone quickly learned the importance of keeping politicians and police officers on his payroll. A well-placed envelope of cash could mean the difference between a raid and a blind eye. This system of corruption was the backbone of Chicago's underworld, and Capone mastered it with ease. As Prohibition took hold, the demand for alcohol skyrocketed. Torrio's organization was ready, smuggling liquor from Canada, producing it in hidden breweries, and selling it through an extensive network of speakeasies. Capone played a key role in expanding these operations, overseeing shipments, negotiating deals, and ensuring that competitors were kept at bay. Bootlegging wasn't just profitable, it was the engine that would drive Capone's rise to power. Still, Chicago was not without its dangers. Rival gangs competed fiercely for territory, and conflicts often turned violent. Capone quickly proved that he was not afraid to defend his organization's interests with force. While Torrio preferred diplomacy, Capone understood that sometimes a show of strength was necessary. His willingness to use violence when required added to his reputation as both protector and enforcer. Despite his growing involvement in crime, Capone maintained the duality that had defined him since Brooklyn. At home, he was a devoted husband and father, providing May and Sonny with comfort and security. He tried to shield them from his criminal life, presenting himself as a family man. Yet on the streets, he was relentless, willing to do whatever it took to advance Torrio's empire and his own standing within it. By the mid-1920s, Capone had become an indispensable part of Torrio's organization. His influence stretched across Chicago, from the South Side brothels to the hidden breweries, fueling the city's thirst for illegal liquor. He was no longer just a promising protégé. He was a rising power in his own right. And as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that Capone's ambition went beyond serving as Torrio's lieutenant. He wanted something more. Chicago had transformed Capone. The boy from Brooklyn's tenements had become a polished gangster, respected and feared in equal measure. He had embraced Torrio's business-like approach to crime, but he had also added his own flair, his charisma, his boldness, and his ability to command loyalty. The city had given him a stage, and he was ready to play the lead role. All he needed was the right moment to step into the spotlight. That moment was coming, and when it did, Al Capone would not just be Torrio's protégé. He would be Chicago's undisputed king of crime. On January 17, 1920, the United States officially went dry. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal across the nation. What lawmakers thought would be a moral victory quickly became one of the greatest opportunities in American criminal history. Overnight, alcohol was no longer just a drink, it was contraband, And for men like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, that meant gold. Chicago, already a city known for its vices, became the epicenter of bootlegging. Speakeasies popped up in every neighborhood, hidden behind restaurant doors, basement entrances, and unmarked backrooms. Thirsty Americans weren't about to give up their liquor, and gangsters were ready to supply it at a premium. For Capone, Prohibition was the perfect storms, a vast market of demand, a weak system of enforcement, and a city government more than willing to look the other way for the right price. Under Torrio's guidance, the organization expanded quickly. They set up hidden breweries and distilleries throughout Chicago and beyond, producing everything from beer to hard liquor. Truckloads of illegal booze were smuggled across state lines or imported from Canada, often protected by bribed police escorts. Every shipment that made it into the city meant more money in the gang's coffers, and the profits were staggering. Within a few years, Torrio's empire, and by extension, Capone's, was earning tens of millions of dollars annually. Capone played a central role in this boom. He oversaw shipments, managed crews, and ensured that operations ran smoothly. But more than logistics, Capone understood image. He cultivated a reputation not just as a gangster, but as a businessman. In his eyes, bootlegging wasn't just crime, it was enterprise. And like any enterprise, it required discipline, organization, and expansion. One of Capone's most successful strategies was building relationships with speakeasy owners and customers. Instead of ruling purely by fear, he made himself approachable, the kind of man who could share a drink and crack a smile while still commanding absolute respect. Patrons saw him as a larger-than-life figure, a man who provided what the government had taken away. In a strange twist, Capone began to be seen as a kind of folk hero, someone standing up against unpopular laws and giving people what they wanted. But behind the charm was a ruthless businessman. Chicago's bootlegging industry wasn't a playground. It was a battlefield. Rival gangs, from Irish mobsters on the north side to smaller Italian outfits across the city, all wanted their share of the profits. Disputes quickly turned violent, and territory became a matter of survival. Capone, while willing to negotiate, was never afraid to use force when necessary. If diplomacy failed, bullets often followed. The profits from bootlegging fueled expansion into other rackets. Gambling dens thrived under Capone's protection, and brothels brought in steady income. The organization also branched into labor racketeering, using intimidation to control unions and squeeze businesses. Every racket fed into the larger empire, and every dollar reinforced Capone's growing influence. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone was no longer just Torrio's protégé, he was the driving force of the operation. Torrio, ever the strategist, was content to let Capone take on more responsibility. But in 1925, Torrio's reign nearly ended when rival gangsters attempted to assassinate him outside his home. Though he survived, the attack shook him deeply. Realizing that the violent world of bootlegging was no longer for him, Torrio decided to step back. He handed control of the empire to his trusted lieutenant, Al Capone. At just 26 years old, Capone suddenly found himself at the head of Chicago's most powerful criminal organization. It was a staggering rise for a man who only a few years earlier had been a Brooklyn street tough. With Torrio's blessing, Capone took the reins and immediately set about reshaping the empire in his own image. Capone expanded operations aggressively. He tightened control over Chicago's South Side, pushed into rival territories, and secured alliances with politicians and law enforcement officials. His network of speakeasies grew into the thousands, each one a source of steady income. The organization's breweries and distilleries pumped out an endless supply of liquor, and the flow of cash seemed unstoppable. By 1927, Capone's empire was estimated to be earning over $100 million a year, a staggering sum in that era. This fortune gave Capone unprecedented power, not just in the underworld, but in the city itself. Judges, police chiefs, aldermen, even mayors. Many were on his payroll. In a city where corruption was woven into the fabric of politics, Capone became the master weaver. And yet, for all his power, Capone never lost touch with the public. He funded charities, provided food for the poor, and occasionally paid hospital bills for struggling families. These acts of generosity, carefully publicized, helped polish his image. To some, he was public enemy number one. To others, he was a modern-day Robin Hood. This dual identity, both feared mob boss and beloved benefactor, only fueled his legend. Still, the darker side of Capone's rule was impossible to ignore. Violence escalated as rival gangs fought for control. Drive-by shootings, bombings, and assassinations became part of daily life in Chicago. The newspapers called it the Beer Wars, and the city seemed trapped in a cycle of bloodshed. For Capone, violence was simply the cost of doing business, a necessary evil to protect his empire. But each killing, each headline, drew more attention from the authorities. Federal agents, journalists, and reformers began to focus their sights on Capone. They saw him not as a folk hero, but as a symbol of corruption and lawlessness. Yet, time and again, he seemed untouchable. Witnesses disappeared, juries were bought, and police investigations went nowhere. It was as if Capone had built a fortress of money and influence around himself. The bootlegging boom had made him rich beyond imagination, but it also painted a target on his back. Every bottle sold, every speakeasy opened, every rival eliminated brought him closer to both unrivaled power and inevitable downfall. For the moment, though, Al Capone stood at the height of his strength. Chicago was his city, and liquor was his crown jewel. The boy from Brooklyn had become the king of Chicago. But as every king learns, power attracts enemies, and Capone's enemies were gathering. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone was no longer just another gangster hustling for control of Chicago's illegal liquor trade. He was the undisputed boss of a sprawling organization, and bootlegging was only the beginning. With Prohibition pouring millions of dollars into his coffers, Capone began to think bigger. He wanted more than territory and profits. He wanted an empire, a system so deeply embedded in the fabric of Chicago that it would be impossible to untangle crime from politics, business, or daily life. Capone's first step in building his empire was diversification. Bootlegging had made him rich, but he understood the dangers of relying on one source of income, especially one that was constantly under government scrutiny. To secure his power, Capone expanded into gambling, prostitution, and racketeering. Chicago's neighborhoods became laboratories of vice, each corner offering some kind of profit for Capone's men. Illegal gambling houses flourished under his protection. From small backroom card games to full-scale betting parlors, Capone's organization collected a cut from every hand dealt and every wager placed. The same was true for prostitution. Brothels across the city operated under his watchful eye, their profits feeding into the ever-growing machine. He also introduced a system of protection rackets, where legitimate businesses were pressured into paying for safety from vandalism or violence. Often violence that Capone's own men would cause if payments weren't made. But Capone's genius wasn't simply in expanding crime, it was in structuring it like a business. He divided the city into districts, each controlled by trusted lieutenants who oversaw collections, enforced discipline, and funneled money upward. This system ensured loyalty, efficiency, and accountability. Those who delivered were rewarded with wealth and influence. Those who failed, or worse, betrayed him, faced swift consequences. Capone's leadership combined incentives with fear, creating a machine that ran smoothly and ruthlessly. Capone also mastered the art of political corruption. Chicago's government was notoriously crooked, and Capone exploited this to his full advantage. He poured money into the pockets of aldermen, judges, police officers, and even mayors. For the right price, raids were canceled, cases were dismissed, and laws were ignored. Capone didn't just bribe officials, he owned them. His reach extended so far into City Hall that at times it seemed the government was merely another branch of his organization. The wealth pouring into his empire also transformed Capone's lifestyle. He became a symbol of excess and extravagance, a living contradiction of the poverty he had known as a boy in Brooklyn. He bought a luxurious mansion in the Chicago suburb of Cicero, complete with bulletproof windows, secret passages, and fortified walls. His wardrobe consisted of silk suits, diamond jewelry, and hand-tailored shoes. He traveled in armored cars and surrounded himself with bodyguards. Wherever he went, he was the center of attention. Yet, Capone never lost his flair for showmanship. He cultivated relationships with journalists, granting interviews and allowing himself to be photographed. He played the role of the charming rogue, often smiling for the camera, cracking jokes, and presenting himself as a man of the people. His public image was carefully managed, while the newspapers described him as a ruthless mobster. They also portrayed him as a celebrity. He attended sporting events, mingled with movie stars, and became a figure the public couldn't ignore. At the same time, Capone understood the value of philanthropy. During the Great Depression, when soup kitchens became lifelines for the poor, Capone opened his own in Chicago. Thousands of hungry families were fed under his name. Whether it was charity or clever propaganda, the effect was the same. Capone was seen not only as a gangster, but as a benefactor. To many struggling citizens, the government had failed them, but Al Capone had not. Still, beneath the polished image and generous gestures lay a core of violence and control. Capone's empire was built on intimidation. Rivals who threatened his dominance often vanished, and disloyalty within his ranks was punished swiftly and brutally. He didn't shy away from using hired killers to enforce order, and his men carried out countless shootings and bombings in the ongoing wars with rival gangs. Capone himself rarely pulled the trigger, but his orders carried the weight of death. One of his most important strongholds was the suburb of Cicero. After Torrio's near assassination, Capone shifted the center of operations there, turning the town into his personal fortress. Cicero's police and politicians were easily bought, and from this base, Capone expanded his control over Chicago's vice districts. Cicero became synonymous with Capone, a town where the mob's grip was absolute and the law had little meaning. Capone's dominance also created an atmosphere of fear among ordinary citizens. Shootings in broad daylight, drive-by attacks, and gangland murders became almost routine. The newspapers called Chicago the crime capital of America, and Capone's name was usually at the center of the headlines. Yet, despite the violence, law enforcement seemed powerless to stop him. Witnesses were too afraid to testify, jurors were bribed or threatened, and police officers were often on his payroll. To the average Chicagoan, it felt as though Capone truly was untouchable. By the late 1920s, Capone's empire was generating unimaginable wealth. Estimates suggested his organization earned more than $100 million annually, a figure that made him not only one of the richest criminals in America, but also one of the most powerful men in Chicago. rivaling the influence of legitimate politicians and businessmen. His empire was so vast that it blurred the line between crime and society, making it difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. But with great power came great scrutiny. Reformers, journalists, and federal agents began to focus their attention squarely on Capone. His empire was too large, his influence too blatant, and his reputation too notorious to ignore. Even as he built his empire higher, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. For the moment, though, Capone's power seemed unshakable. He had built more than a criminal network. He had built a kingdom. From bootlegging to gambling, prostitution to politics, Chicago was his domain, and every dollar that changed hands seemed to pass through him. The boy from Brooklyn had become the emperor of vice, and like every empire in history, his would face challenges from enemies outside and within. But in the roaring years of the late 1920s, there was no denying one simple truth. Al Capone ruled Chicago. By the late 1920s, Al Capone was no longer just the boss of Chicago's underworld. He was a household name across America. In a city gripped by corruption and bloodshed, Capone's face appeared on front pages. His name was whispered in speakeasies, and his legend grew with every passing day. He wasn't simply a gangster, he had become a public figure, both admired and despised. To some, he was the ultimate outlaw turned businessman, defying unpopular laws and providing what the people craved. To others, he was a dangerous symbol of lawlessness, the very reason Prohibition seemed like a failed experiment. Capone's relationship with the press was central to this transformation. Unlike many criminals who shunned attention, Capone embraced it. He understood the power of publicity and played the media like a violin. Reporters were given access to him, sometimes even invited into his headquarters. He posed for photographs in sharp suits and wide-brimmed hats, flashing the smile that contrasted so starkly with the violence associated with his name. He gave interviews that painted him as a businessman, insisting that he was merely meeting public demand. "I supply a public demand," he once told reporters, and in many ways, the public agreed. The press was fascinated by him. Newspapers painted him as a paradox, the ruthless mobster who could order a killing one day and hand out turkeys to the poor on Thanksgiving the next. Capone thrived on this duality. He knew that by showing a softer, charitable side, he could soften his image and, in some cases, win public sympathy. During the Great Depression, he funded soup kitchens that fed thousands of hungry Chicagoans. Families who might have despised him for his role in crime instead thanked him for a hot meal. For those struggling to survive, Capone's generosity seemed more real than the distant promises of politicians. This Robin Hood image was no accident. Capone deliberately crafted it. He made sure his acts of charity were seen and reported, knowing it built goodwill among ordinary people. And while the newspapers criticized his violence, they couldn't resist the drama of his story. Every headline, whether praising or condemning him, added to his myth. Yet, beneath the carefully managed image, Capone's power rested on fear and control. Violence was not just an occasional tool. It was the foundation of his empire. His men carried out assassinations, bombings, and drive-by shootings, leaving bodies in the streets and fear in the hearts of rivals. Chicago became infamous for its gangland killings, and Capone's name was usually tied to the bloodshed, whether directly or indirectly. The irony was that Capone rarely faced consequences. Time after time, he escaped prosecution. Witnesses disappeared, juries were bribed, and police officers conveniently lost evidence. To many Americans, it seemed as though the law itself bent around him. This reputation as untouchable only added to his mystique. While reformers called him a menace, ordinary citizens marveled at his ability to outwit the system. Capone also reveled in his celebrity status. He attended high-profile boxing matches and baseball games, often sitting in the best seats with an entourage of bodyguards. He was seen dining at the city's finest restaurants, rubbing shoulders with entertainers and politicians alike. His presence turned heads wherever he went, and reporters followed him eagerly. In an age when Hollywood was creating screen icons, Capone was a real-life version of the larger-than-life characters audiences loved to watch. But with fame came danger. Rival gangs, resentful of his dominance, plotted against him. The North Side Gang, led by George "Bugs" Moran, was his most persistent enemy. The battles between Capone's South Side mob and Moran's crew turned Chicago into a war zone. Each side launched attacks, and the city's citizens paid the price, living in constant fear of being caught in the crossfire. The press reported each killing with sensational headlines, and the public appetite for the drama only grew. Capone's notoriety also brought him under increasing scrutiny from law enforcement. Local authorities were often compromised by bribes, but the federal government began to take notice. Prohibition agents and Treasury Department investigators kept a close eye on Capone, determined to bring him down. Reformers and religious groups demanded action, calling him the embodiment of everything wrong with America's moral fabric. Still, Capone seemed unfazed. He projected confidence, acting as though no law could touch him. His bravado, combined with his generosity and his undeniable charisma, made him both loved and hated. He embodied the contradictions of Prohibition-era America, a criminal who thrived because of laws that most citizens despised, a violent gangster who became a celebrity, and a man who offered kindness to the poor while ruling through terror. For Chicagoans, Capone was everywhere. His speakeasies provided liquor, his gambling dens offered entertainment, and his name dominated headlines. He had become larger than the city itself, a figure so powerful that even the mayor, William "Big Bill" Thompson, openly courted his support. Thompson, known as one of the most corrupt mayors in Chicago's history, welcomed Capone's money and influence during elections. For a time, it seemed as though Capone's grip on Chicago wasn't just criminal, it was political. Yet, for all his power, the tide was beginning to turn. The violence of the bootlegging wars shocked the nation, and the federal government grew increasingly determined to make an example of him. Capone's fame, once an asset, was becoming a liability. Every headline, every photograph, every interview made him more visible, more vulnerable. But in the late 1920s, Capone still stood at the peak of his empire. He was the face of organized crime in America, the man who had turned Prohibition into fortune, and the gangster who lived like a king while the nation struggled. The people who lined up at his soup kitchens saw him as a savior. The politicians who took his bribes saw him as a partner, and the reformers who railed against him saw him as the ultimate enemy of law and order. He was, in every sense of the phrase, America's public enemy number one, and soon his most infamous act of violence, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, would cement that title forever. By 1929, Al Capone stood at the height of his power. He controlled Chicago's bootlegging, gambling, and vice industries, and his wealth and influence reached into every corner of the city. But for all his power, one obstacle remained: George "Bugs" Moran and the North Side Gang. Their rivalry had defined much of Chicago's gangland warfare throughout the 1920s. Moran and Capone despised each other, and neither man was willing to back down. For Capone, eliminating Moran meant eliminating the last major threat to his empire. The animosity between the two gangs had been escalating for years. Moran's men had attempted hits on Capone's lieutenants, while Capone's crew had retaliated with equal ferocity. Chicago became a battlefield, with drive-by shootings and ambushes terrorizing the city's streets. Dozens of men on both sides were killed in the cycle of revenge. Capone, calculating as ever, realized that piecemeal attacks would never end the war. If he wanted true control, he needed to strike a decisive blow. That blow came on the morning of February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. While Capone himself was conveniently in Florida, far from the bloodshed, his men in Chicago prepared one of the most infamous ambushes in American history. The plan was deceptively simple. Moran and his men were expected at a garage on North Clark Street, a hangout where the gang stored trucks and liquor shipments. Capone's men arranged for a large shipment of bootleg whiskey to be delivered there, luring Moran's crew into a trap. As the North Side men gathered inside the garage, Capone's gunmen arrived in disguise. Dressed as police officers, they pulled up in a car that looked like a police vehicle. The disguise was perfect. After all, police raids on bootlegging operations were common. Inside the garage, 7 men, Moran's associates, were lined up against a brick wall by the supposed officers. Believing it was just another raid, the men complied. Then, without warning, Capone's gunmen opened fire. Armed with Thompson submachine guns and shotguns, they unleashed a hail of bullets into the defenseless men. The barrage lasted only moments, but when the smoke cleared, the garage floor was littered with bodies. 6 men were killed instantly, while a 7th, despite being riddled with bullets, died later in the hospital. The scene was gruesome. The victims were torn apart by gunfire, their bodies slumped in pools of blood against the cold brick wall. The precision and brutality of the massacre shocked, even hardened Chicagoans. It wasn't just another gangland killing. It was slaughter, carried out with military-style efficiency. Ironically, Bugs Moran himself escaped the ambush. Running late that morning, he spotted what appeared to be police entering the garage and decided to stay away. His tardiness saved his life, but it also made him the target of ridicule. The North Side gang had been decimated, and Moran's power was broken. In one morning, Capone had effectively removed his greatest rival from the playing field. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the country splashed photographs of the crime scene on their front pages. The public was horrified, while Chicagoans had grown accustomed to gangland violence. The sheer scale and cold-blooded nature of the Valentine's Day killings shocked the nation. This wasn't a back alley shooting. It was a massacre. Executed in broad daylight, with victims lined up and gunned down as though they were soldiers in a war. For the first time, Americans began to see organized crime not just as local corruption or vice, but as a national crisis. The massacre became a turning point in how the public, the press, and the government viewed Al Capone. Capone, as always, denied involvement. When reporters asked about the massacre, he dismissed the idea that he had anything to do with it. After all, he pointed out, he had been in Florida at the time, but nobody was fooled. The timing, the precision, and the sheer audacity of the attack all bore his signature. To the public, it didn't matter whether Capone had pulled the trigger. His hand was behind the massacre, and everyone knew it. The fallout was immediate. While the massacre had weakened Moran, it also brought unprecedented attention to Capone. Reformers demanded action. Politicians who had once looked the other way now felt pressure to clamp down. Federal law enforcement, embarrassed by its inability to control Chicago's gangs, began ramping up efforts to target Capone. The image of Scarface, as a folk hero began to fade, replaced by that of a ruthless tyrant whose lust for power had drenched Chicago in blood. Yet, in the twisted logic of organized crime, the massacre achieved its goal. With Moran's North Side gang crippled, Capone's control over Chicago became nearly absolute. He had no real rivals left in the city. For a time, his empire ran unchallenged. His profits soared, and his dominance seemed complete. But the price of victory was steep. The massacre had made Capone more infamous than ever before, and in that infamy lay the seeds of his downfall. The Stain. Valentine's Day Massacre was more than a gangland killing. It was a cultural shockwave. It defined an era, symbolizing the brutality of Prohibition and the unchecked power of organized crime. It turned Al Capone into America's most wanted man, the face of corruption and violence in the roaring 20s. In the years that followed, Capone would continue to enjoy wealth and power, but he could never escape the shadow of Valentine's Day, 1929. It was the event that cemented his legend, and the event that convinced the nation that Al Capone had to be stopped. The Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 had given Al Capone the dominance he sought in Chicago. Bugs Moran's gang had been shattered, his rivals silenced, and the city's underworld bent to his command. Yet even as Capone celebrated his greatest victory, the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. The brutality of the massacre had horrified the nation, and for the first time, the federal government realized that Al Capone wasn't just a local menace. He was a national problem. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. Until then, many Americans had admired Capone's defiance of Prohibition and his Robin Hood like acts of charity. But photographs of 7 men gunned down in cold blood against a brick wall changed that. The massacre stripped away the glamour and revealed the ruthless reality of organized crime. Ordinary citizens no longer saw Capone as a folk hero. They saw him as a murderer who had turned their city into a war zone. Chicago itself was buckling under the weight of his empire. Corruption ran so deep that citizens felt helpless. Police officers, judges, and politicians were on Capone's payroll, and witnesses were too terrified to testify. Local authorities had proven incapable of stopping him. If anything was to be done, it would have to come from outside Chicago. Enter the federal government. In Washington, reformers and law enforcement officials began pushing for new strategies to bring down Capone. They knew that trying to prosecute him for murder or bootlegging was nearly impossible. Witnesses disappeared, jurors were bribed, and evidence mysteriously vanished. But there was another angle, one that had been overlooked: tax evasion. The U.S. Treasury Department realized that while Capone flaunted his wealth with mansions, luxury cars, and diamond jewelry, he had never filed an honest tax return. If his income could be proven, then he could be prosecuted not for violence or bootlegging, but for failing to pay taxes. It was a technicality, but it was a weakness in the armor of a man who seemed otherwise invincible. At the same time, another battlefront was opening. The Prohibition Bureau, desperate to curb Capone's bootlegging operations, formed a special unit of federal agents. This squad was led by a young, determined lawman named Eliot Ness. Unlike the corrupt officials of Chicago, Ness and his men had reputations for honesty and discipline. They became known as the Untouchables, a nickname that reflected their refusal to be bribed or intimidated. Ness and his team launched a relentless campaign against Capone's breweries, warehouses, and distribution networks. They conducted raids, smashed barrels, and confiscated trucks. While these actions didn't topple Capone's empire, they disrupted his operations and sent a message that the federal government was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. Ness also used publicity to his advantage, feeding stories of his team's successes to the press. For the first time, Capone found himself competing with another celebrity, the clean-cut young agent who represented law and order. Meanwhile, Treasury agents worked quietly, building the financial case against Capone. They tracked his hidden ledgers, interviewed former associates, and pieced together evidence of his lavish spending. The case was slow and methodical, but it grew stronger with each passing month. Capone's arrogance made their job easier. He lived so extravagantly that it was impossible to hide the true scale of his wealth. Capone, for his part, tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He continued to live like a king, hosting lavish parties, attending high-profile sporting events, and basking in the spotlight. But the pressure was mounting. Raids disrupted his bootlegging. His men faced increasing arrests, and federal agents seemed to be closing in. Even worse, cracks began to appear inside his own organization. Fear of prosecution led some associates to turn informant, and loyalty was no longer as certain as it had once been. By 1930, Capone's reputation had shifted from untouchable to public enemy. The Chicago Crime Commission officially named him Public Enemy Number 1, a title that stuck and defined his image in the national consciousness. Instead of being admired, he was now the embodiment of everything wrong with Prohibition-era crime. Politicians who had once taken his money began distancing themselves, and ordinary citizens demanded justice. The irony was clear. The very massacre that had secured Capone's dominance also triggered the chain of events that would bring about his fall. The more he flaunted his power, the more determined the government became to destroy him. And unlike the corrupt officials of Chicago, federal investigators couldn't be bought or bullied. Capone himself seemed to sense the tightening noose. His paranoia grew, and he surrounded himself with bodyguards at all times. He armored his cars, fortified his mansion, and rarely appeared in public without protection. Yet, none of this could shield him from the quiet work of accountants and agents who were patiently building the case that would one day put him behind bars. By the end of 1930, the empire that had once seemed indestructible was under siege. His rivals were gone, but his true enemy was now the United States government, a foe that could not be gunned down or bribed away. The fall of Al Capone had begun, and though he still enjoyed the luxuries of his wealth, the walls were closing in. The boy from Brooklyn who had risen to rule Chicago was now facing his greatest challenge. And this time, no amount of charm, charity, or violence would save him. By 1931, Al Capone was still living in luxury, but the empire he had built was crumbling under relentless federal pressure. Eliot, Ness, and the Untouchables continued smashing his bootlegging operations, and the Treasury Department's investigators had assembled a mountain of evidence showing Capone's failure to pay income taxes. For years, Capone had seemed untouchable, but now his greatest enemy was not a rival gangster. It was the United States government. The strategy was simple but brilliant. Capone could not be convicted of murder, extortion, or bootlegging. Too many witnesses had been silenced. Too many jurors bribed, too many officials corrupted. But the law was clear: anyone who earned income, even illegally, had to pay taxes. Capone had flaunted his wealth so openly that his crimes could no longer be hidden. The government prepared to charge him not for violence, but for tax evasion. It was a charge that lacked glamour, yet carried the weight of real prison time. When Capone was formally indicted in 1931, the news exploded across the nation. Reporters who had once treated him like a celebrity now swarmed the courthouse, eager to witness the fall of America's most infamous mob boss. Capone, ever the showman, arrived at the proceedings in custom-tailored suits, flashing his trademark smile and waving to the crowds. He believed, as always, that money and influence could buy his freedom. But the federal government had learned from decades of frustration. They anticipated Capone's attempts to rig the system. When the trial began in October 1931, the government pulled a bold move just before jury selection. The entire panel was quietly switched out. Capone's men, who had already bribed and threatened the original jurors, were caught off guard. The new jury had been secretly brought in, untouched by corruption. It was a masterstroke that left Capone scrambling. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented a meticulous case. Treasury agents detailed Capone's lavish spending, mansions, jewelry, cars, and gambling debts, all without any record of taxes paid. They introduced secret ledgers seized from Capone's operations, with handwriting analysis linking them to his men. Former employees testified about the flow of money, some reluctantly, others eager to save themselves. Piece by piece, the prosecution built the picture of a man who had grown enormously rich by illegal means and had never given the government its due. Capone's defense team, funded by his fortune, argued that he was simply a businessman providing for public demand. They tried to portray him as a victim of political persecution, a man unfairly targeted because of his fame. They insisted that no direct evidence tied Capone himself to the financial records. But the jury wasn't persuaded. The paper trail was too strong, the testimony too convincing, and the arrogance of Capone's lifestyle too undeniable. Throughout the trial, Capone's confidence began to waver. For years, he had controlled the game, bribing judges and bending laws. But here, in a federal courtroom protected against his influence, he faced something unfamiliar, a fair fight. And in that fight, the evidence was overwhelming. On October 17, 1931, the jury delivered its verdict. Al Capone was found guilty of tax evasion. The courtroom erupted in shock. The man who had once seemed invincible, who had outsmarted rivals and defied the law at every turn, was finally convicted. The sentence was severe 11 years in federal prison, along with a 50 Zarozen fine and a 30 Zarozen in court costs. At the time, it was the harshest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion. Capone, who had lived like a king for nearly a decade, would now spend his prime years behind bars. The reaction across America was electric. Newspapers hailed the conviction as a victory for law and order. Headlines declared that the reign of public enemy #1 was over. For ordinary citizens, it was proof that even the most powerful gangster could be brought down, not by bullets, but by the law. Capone's image as untouchable had been shattered. Yet, even in defeat, Capone tried to maintain appearances. He smiled for the cameras, insisting that he would survive prison just as he had survived every challenge before. But behind the bravado, he knew his world had collapsed. His empire, once vast and unshakable, began to fracture without him. Rivals circled, his men turned on each other, and the flow of illegal money slowed. Capone had been the glue that held the Chicago outfit together. Without him at the helm, it was never the same. Capone was first sent to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1932. Accustomed to luxury, he expected special treatment. For a time, he lived more comfortably than other inmates, bribing guards for privileges. But reports of his behavior reached Washington, and officials decided to make an example of him. In 1934, Capone was transferred to the new maximum security prison on Alcatraz Island, the Rock. There, cut off from the outside world, with no access to his money or influence, Al Capone became just another inmate. The irony of his downfall was striking. For years, he had killed rivals, bribed politicians, and terrorized a city, yet none of those crimes had put him in prison. What finally ended his reign was something as mundane as failing to pay taxes. The man who had seemed larger than life was undone by the smallest details of the law. In the end, the trial of Al Capone wasn't just the story of one man's downfall. It was a turning point in America's fight against organized crime. It proved that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of justice, and it marked the end of an era in which gangsters ruled Chicago with impunity. The boy from Brooklyn, who had clawed his way to the top of Chicago's underworld, was now a prisoner, stripped of his empire and his freedom. His rise had been meteoric, his reign bloody, and his fall inevitable. But even as he was led away in chains, the legend of Al Capone only grew larger. When the heavy prison gates closed behind Al Capone in 1932, the world outside was changing rapidly. The Great Depression had deepened, Prohibition was nearing its end, and the gangster who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist was now just another inmate in a gray uniform. For the first time since his rise to power, Capone had no control, no bodyguards, no bribes to protect him. He was stripped of everything except his name, and even that carried little weight inside prison walls. At the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Capone expected to receive special treatment. For a while, he managed to live more comfortably than other prisoners, using money and influence to obtain small privileges, better bedding, extra food, and even access to a banjo, which he played in a prison band. But those advantages didn't last. Reports of his behavior reached federal officials, and the government decided Capone needed to be broken. In 1934, he was transferred to the brand new fortress of American prisons, Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was designed to hold the most dangerous and unmanageable criminals in the country, men who could not be controlled elsewhere. On the Rock, bribery was impossible. Guards were carefully chosen, the rules were absolute, and isolation was total. For Capone, who had thrived on influence and power, Alcatraz was a cage like no other. Life on Alcatraz was harsh. Capone was given inmate number 85, stripped of his silk suits and diamond rings, and subjected to the same routine as every other prisoner. He worked in the laundry, followed the rigid schedule, and endured the silence of the prison's infamous rules. For the first time, Capone was truly powerless. His empire in Chicago crumbled without him, but he could do nothing to stop it. Worse than the loss of power was the decline of his health. Years earlier, Capone had contracted syphilis, a disease that went untreated for too long. By the time he reached Alcatraz, it had begun to affect his body and his mind. He suffered from headaches, tremors, and periods of confusion. Fellow inmates noticed that the once brilliant strategist who had commanded armies of men now struggled to perform simple tasks. His mental sharpness faded, replaced by paranoia and childlike behavior. Despite his decline, Capone tried to adapt. He played in the prison band, strumming his banjo and joining in with other inmates on Sunday concerts for the prison population. It was a far cry from the glamorous nightlife he had once known in Chicago's speakeasies, but it was all that remained of his showman spirit. Behind the music, though, his health continued to deteriorate. In 1939, after serving about 7 years, Capone was released early for good behavior, but the man who walked out of prison was a shadow of the gangster who had entered. At just 40 years old, Capone's mind was said to be that of a child. He was often confused, his speech slowed, and his once commanding presence reduced to fragility. He returned not to Chicago, but to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida, where he spent his remaining years in relative seclusion. The world he had once dominated had moved on. Prohibition had ended in 1933, stripping bootleggers of their fortunes. New crime bosses had risen in Chicago, and the outfit no longer needed Capone. The newspapers that had once chased his every move now reported on new scandals, new enemies, and a new era of crime. Capone was yesterday's news. In Florida, his life was quiet, almost pitiful. He spent his days fishing from his boat, tending to his gardens, and sitting in the sun. He still dressed well, clinging to the appearance of the man he had once been. But the sharp mind that had built an empire was gone. Family members shielded him from the public, embarrassed by his condition. Stories circulated of Capone wandering the grounds of his estate, talking to imaginary friends, or sitting silently for hours, lost in thought. Doctors confirmed that syphilis had eaten away at his brain, leaving him with severe dementia. At times, his mental capacity was compared to that of a 12-year-old child. The man who had once terrified a city could no longer command even his own thoughts. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of a stroke complicated by pneumonia at the age of 48. He passed away in his Palm Island home, surrounded by family. News of his death made headlines, but the world reacted with less shock than it once would have. Capone had been absent from power for so long that his death felt like the closing of a chapter already written. In the end, Capone's life was a story of contradictions. He had risen from the streets of Brooklyn to rule Chicago's underworld, building an empire of crime during America's most turbulent era. He was both feared and admired, a ruthless killer and a generous benefactor. He embodied the excess and violence of the Roaring Twenties, yet his downfall came not from bullets or betrayals, but from something as mundane as unpaid taxes. His legacy is complicated. To some, he remains the ultimate gangster, the symbol of Prohibition-era crime. To others, he is a cautionary tale, a man whose ambition and arrogance led to his destruction. But one truth remains undeniable. Al Capone's story is inseparable from the history of America itself. His rise and fall mirrored the nation's struggles with law, corruption, and morality in the early 20th century. From the streets of Brooklyn to the fortress of Alcatraz, from the throne of Chicago to the quiet death in Florida, Capone's journey was unlike any other. He was, for better or worse, the face of organized crime in America, and though his empire crumbled and his mind betrayed him, the legend of Al Capone, the untouchable mob boss, lives on.